but just the process of decision making. Because ultimately, what I start with everyone who I take care of, no matter the capacity that they engage me, is I'm trying to figure out their goal. If the goal and the only goal is, I don't like the way I feel every day, how do I feel better? All these different things. And I came from I didn't actually like feelings. I didn't like therapy. I didn't like talking about emotions. I didn't want to take psychology courses. I wanted to understand the nitty gritty. I very much was fascinated by the biochemical, biophysical model of disease. And I worked through in the integrative world just about every paradigm I could find, looking at mold toxins, heavy metals, allergies, autoimmune diseases, problems with light, EMF pollution, all these different various emotional or not emotional, biophysical, biochemical, even biomechanical contributors to illness and specifically mental illness. But that model ultimately falls apart because there are psychosocial factors that play into them. That's not to say that the biochemical and biophysical doesn't have a role to play, right? Because if you're doing things that are going to manipulate in the end how your brain fundamentally works, and light, sound, electromagnetic radiations, nutrition, this plays a critical role, right, in how your brain functions, the decisions that you make. You can take anyone and turn them into a uh, emotional train wreck if you expose them to the wrong environment, the wrong chemicals. But you can do the same thing with the wrong people. And I learned that the hard way, both, frankly, both personally and professionally. There's a lot of malignant personality types in medicine. And then I started to look, because of my experiences as a physician, dealing with these people as mentors, teachers, colleagues. And I realized that this initial instinct that I'd had, that I needed to look at the biochemical, the biophysical, biomechanical, while important, I was missing this essential component of how people interact and their psychosocial environment that was just driving just as much disease as the other things I'd been fascinated by. So yeah, I mean, I have to tease all of that apart when I'm looking at a case. And that is very challenging because it's an enormous number of different factors we have to work through, which is why I like to do things like group coaching. And when I do group coaching, I'm educating everyone on the call at the same time about the common factors that are causing their illness, no matter what it may be. And likewise, when we do group coaching and people ask me about labs and what role the lab abnormalities they have may be playing in their illness, I talk to them about how the labs become deranged and what role they play. And I'll do the same thing if I have a feeling that someone's got a psychosocial driver of their illness, a toxic boss, a toxic work culture, a toxic marriage, toxic relationship. It's funny. I joke with my patients, in order to get at their goals, I'll say, what are your if I could snap my fingers right now and make 3 of your problems go away, and they can't be stepchildren, in-laws, or taxes, what would they be and why? And it always gets a laugh, but it gets at this idea of, what are these problems? And then we work backwards from there to what's causing them. I'll never forget this moment. I was in the hospital in my last year of residency. The hospital was running at capacity every week, week after week, month after month, in the middle of the summer. The middle of the summer is supposed to be the low season for medical care in hospitals. And I remember speaking to the chief of the internal medicine department, supposedly one of the smartest people in the hospital, one of the people with the most clout, the most influence. And I asked him, I said, what's your plan for when January, December, February, flu season, the natural peak in death and disease and acute illness that we see? What's your plan? What are we going to do when the ICUs are overflowing? And he said, well, we've got some plans to make these 2 rooms in this wing into patient rooms. And then we're going to build, we're going to demolish the parking garage and we're going to build a whole new wing of the hospital. And I thought to myself, this guy is completely missing the boat on the real problem here. The problem's not how do we have more capacity in the hospital? It's how does our civilization and our society and our economy sustain the loss of productive working people and working years in working productive people in order to pay for the care of the chronically ill, most of whom need a really serious conversation about why they're basically burning their health to the ground, one Twinkie, hot dog, Hostess snack cake at a time. And, they just think, oh, well, we just need to add a couple more hospital beds, which to me is insane. It's like saying, the house is on fire, and, we're going to, I don't know, use a water pistol to try and put it out. John Muir had this really fascinating quote that I love. He said, thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wildness is a necessity. And when I read that in my, a couple of years ago when I found it, I love quotes for people who didn't realize that. I thought this is an incredible insight from a guy who knew nothing about medicine, that our society is becoming sick because it's over-civilized. And people are really overstimulated. And what you said about stress is such a fascinating word. Stress actually means to pull apart in, I believe it's Latin or maybe it's Greek. And what people don't realize is that there's eustress and there's distress. Eustress is stress that you can adapt to because you have the necessary resources in order to adapt to it. That is, you go to the gym, you do a bicep curl, your bicep gets bigger, your tendons get a little stronger, your bones where the tendons insert get a little bit stronger because you're putting force on it. There's a piezoelectric current that's generated by that through the bone. And that's why people who don't exercise essentially fall apart. And that's eustress. Distress is when you push the body into a state where resources have been exhausted and the body can no longer adapt. And you can live in that state for a long period of time, but eventually it always results in early death, premature morbidity, mortality, and the emergence of really significant disease. Heart rate variability is the variability in, oh boy, I'm about to butcher this, but it's a measurement of the variability in different intervals within the cycle of a heartbeat. I got deep into using HRV in my practice as a clinician and a coach when I teamed up with Jim Laird, who's the strength and conditioning coach I work with now in both actually the medical and the coaching practice. I realized very quickly about a year ago that I was going to have a massive benefit for my people from having Jim involved, because he's an expert in strength and conditioning, but he's also, he's spent 25 years training people and he's taught me a lot. And a lot of the concepts I just related about stress, he really came to understand through his personal experience. As somebody who was at one point one of the strongest people in the world, he squatted 1,000 pounds at one time. It was his PR. Wow. He set the world record for that at the time. Yeah. And then in the example I used of ulcerative colitis, he actually then got ulcerative colitis like the exact same day that he set that PR. And then he tells a great story on a number of podcasts. People can look him up. He's had a lot of great appearances where he's told this story. He realized he needed to forgive some people. And then when he forgave them, finally that went into remission, right? Now, it didn't help his body at the time that he was using huge doses of testosterone in order to become a power lifter and one of the world's strongest men. It didn't help that he was, running on nicotine, caffeine, ephedra, stimulants. You get into the powerlifting world, they're really, what they're doing is they're pushing their body into as much of a stress state as possible so that it can do things that are almost supernatural. And he then took that experience back into training people, understanding that, and he'd already done, a lot of work at, D1 schools with professional athletes. And he brought HRV in when he met Joel Jameson, who's the innovator, I think probably one of the leading innovators of HRV. And he realized that he could use this as a metric to define and understand where people were with their rest and recovery. We use the Oura Ring, which is a device that has an airplane mode, so you're not being irradiated by it all the time, which we also keep track of. But we use HRV to judge someone's ability to recover from stress, and also how hard they've basically been living. Because if you take someone who's got a single digit HRV, that person's been living in a stress state for a long period of time. And they'll begin to see patterns in that data that help them understand what's actually making them ill. This becomes very hard to isolate the variables, right? But you'll get them figuring out things like, when my mother-in-law comes to visit, my HRV drops through the floor. Maybe I need to take a hard look at that relationship and how it's driving. Because stress, the reality of stress is that a true stress stimulates the release of the chemicals and hormones you need to respond to it. Cortisol, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. Your body's got a finite capacity to make those. driven in part by your nutritional inputs, right? But also by your natural ability to synthesize and secrete them. And when you exhaust those, you tend to run people into those low HRV ranges. And it becomes an incredibly powerful tool, particularly for people who have very poor insight. Many people will tell you, I feel fine. I feel fine. I feel the way I've felt for 4 decades. Now I just happen to have this new illness that I need you to help me get rid of. And we say, you think you're fine because you're totally habituated to living in a stressed out state.